Migrants or refugees, thousands of people fleeing war and destruction. Are their hopes of safety even threatened by the language used to describe their journey? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Mike Hanna. Thousands of words, hundreds of reports on television and radio, all of them summed up in a single photograph. This is Laith Majid, a Syrian from Deir ez-Zor, holding his son and daughter after they arrived safely on the Greek island of Kos. They made the crossing on a flimsy rubber boat with about 15 others. The tears in his eyes are of joy and relief. On Inside Story, we ask, is this man a refugee or a migrant? And we explore why the language we use really matters. We've seen images of desperation and chaos from the Mediterranean to the English Channel. Macedonian police used tear gas to drive back refugees at the border. And on Thursday, they declared a state of emergency, which means the army is being deployed to stop people transiting through the country. British and French authorities have announced a new command and control centre in Calais. 5,000 people are living in makeshift camps there, awaiting the chance to smuggle themselves into the UK. And Germany wants to see measures to stop new arrivals travelling unchecked through Europe. The country's expecting a record 800,000 people to apply for asylum this year. That's more than the entire EU combined total in 2014. If this is a political crisis, it's also a humanitarian one. Hundreds more people are arriving on the Greek islands every day. Al Jazeera's Jonah Hull reports from Kos.
The seafront in Kos at the height of the holiday season has become a refugee camp. Tourists might once have lingered here for the view. They don't anymore. Outside the police station, frustration rises by the day. Those with more obvious claims to asylum, like Syrians fleeing civil war, are given priority and processed fairly quickly. Others fend for themselves.
Thank you.
International agencies are trying to help speed up a process that is grindingly slow, but they say they're getting little help from the local authorities.
We have offered to the municipal authorities our support. We can provide tents, we can provide services, but they have...
How quickly?
We can provide it very quickly, but we need them to provide us a site where we can put the tents.
And so the Greeks are dragging their feet?
Let's say we haven't received a positive reply yet.
This is what passes for formal accommodation, an abandoned hotel with meagre facilities.
Contagious diseases, infectious diseases, we're facing diseases that are coming from their countries. We have malaria cases, scabies cases, some typhoids, TBs.
Could the authorities be doing more, do you think?
They could help a little bit more. How
long have you been here?
20 days, maybe 5 days, 15 days, and 20 days only.
In that time, have you had any help, any support?
No, everything is very bad now here.
Where do you want to go?
Want to go Germany.
Germany?
Yes.
Germany, sir.
You?
Germany.
You?
Germany.
There was a day when multiple nationalities gathered round this pool, Germans, Dutch, perhaps British holidaymakers. These days they come from countries like Nigeria, Mali, Pakistan, Afghanistan. The hotel captain Elias now offers holidays from hell. Back on the coastal strip, the restaurateurs complain that the refugees have driven business away. In the mayor's office, there seems to be a reluctance to offer more practical assistance. The tourists, meanwhile, walk on, in search of a place to eat with a better view. Jonah Hull, Al Jazeera, Kos.
Well, let's now welcome our guests. In London, we have Gary van Gulik, Deputy Director for Amnesty International in Europe and Central Asia. In Paris, François Germain, a research fellow from the Centre for Ethnic and Migration Studies. And also in London, Adrian Berry, a barrister from the Garden Court Chambers and chair of the Immigration Practitioners Association. Welcome to you all. Let's begin with Gari van Gulik. We've seen pressure building in Greece. Now Macedonia is emerging as a new transit point for refugees, and still no solutions, no overarching solutions in sight, are there?
Well, exactly. What we're asking ourselves as we keep documenting crisis after crisis, desperate situation after desperate story, how many times do we need to see these crises before there's the realization and the acknowledgement of a very unavoidable truth that none of this could happen if Europe has a better solution to the overall crisis. And that means more entry points for refugees who need protection, more ways in, and a much more holistic, sustainable approach to address this problem. How many people are we going to lose because of this lack of action that we're seeing?
Well, Francois Jobin, we're talking specifically at this point with regard to Macedonia, with regard to Greece, as transient points, transit points that many argue is a period of 72 hours where people are attempting to move on to the next stage. But this appears to confound the entire problem, does it not?
Yeah, in a way it does. But I think it's important to remember that this is not unprecedented for Europe and that it is not really a migration crisis. Rather, it is, and this is the way I see it at least, this is a crisis of Europe, of Europe's identity and ideal. The question really now is, for how long will Europe accept to continue to be the deadliest destination in the world for migrants, and will finally someone have the guts to realize that this is a crisis for Europe and a crisis for Europe identity and ideal?
Well, Adrian Berry, Europe appears to be attempting to deal with it, as it is at all, on a nation-state basis. There is very little interstate discussion or attempts to create some kind of overarching way to deal with this that does not have to do with security. There is agreement on how to stop people coming into nation-states, but not agreement on how to help them do so.
I think that's right. I mean, in the first instance, most of these people are in fact refugees when they're from countries like Syria and Eritrea and indeed even Afghanistan coming into the European Union. Not only are they refugees, but the problem needs to be seen in a humanitarian context, that some immediate provision not only to facilitate entry of people who are forced to migrate because they're refugees into the European Union is required, but also the issue needs to be identified in terms of first and foremost of the immediate humanitarian assistance which needs to be rendered to these people as people, rather than seeing this as a problem of security or of border control.
Well, in essence, dealing with it as a humanitarian crisis requires critical points of definition. The words refugee and migrant have often been used interchangeably when discussing Europe's migration crisis, and that itself may be at the root of the problem. Refugees are people who have fled persecution and lack the protection of their own countries, says the United Nations. On the other hand, migrants leave their countries to seek better jobs or education. They continue to have the protection of their home governments. International law gives refugees very specific protections that aren't extended to migrants. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that everyone has the right to seek asylum from persecution in other countries. And the 1951 UN Refugee Convention protects refugees from being returned to countries where they risk persecution. Gari van Gulik, clearly this is not just a matter of semantics. It is crucial to determining how states respond to this ongoing crisis, is it not?
Absolutely. These words matter very much, and we notice them being used in wrong ways, often on purpose to play political games quite often, or to use them to stop providing services or access to borders. Now, to be very clear, all people on the move, migrants or refugees, have a right to dignity, to certain humanitarian conditions that are okay, so shelter, food, etc. And even those provisions are not right now provided in, for example, Greece and now the border with Macedonia. But when it comes to refugees, and again, there's a few countries in the world that we consider the people coming from there are prima facie refugees, so we consider them as refugees whether they went through a process or not. That includes Syria, Eritrea, for example, Iraq, and also Afghanistan in many cases. So a lot of the people, in fact, the lion's share, as the EU agency Frontex called it, of the people entering Europe irregularly are from those countries. So it's fair to say that the vast majority of people now entering the territory of Europe are refugees, and so they deserve the protection entitled to them by international law.
And yet, Adrian Berry, some appear to disagree. The British Prime Minister David Cameron stating unequivocally that he sees the majority of those seeking refuge in Britain as economic migrants rather than as political refugees. So there's clearly differences between nation states in Europe as to who is what.
It's very unclear where the Prime Minister gets the evidence to make the assertion that they are economic migrants rather than refugees. In the numbers of people entering the European Union who are forced to flee because of persecution and then reaching Calais in order to seek entry into the United Kingdom via the Channel Tunnel, those people come from the general population of people fleeing persecution from countries like Syria, from countries like Eritrea. That makes them refugees, and even beyond the narrow definition of refugee in the 1951 Refugee Convention, if other people will be forced to migrate for other reasons, perhaps for reasons of economic collapse or environmental disaster, those people are also forced to flee and they deserve humanitarian assistance. The idea that people are travelling into the European Union merely for economic improvement is specious and is not borne out by the evidence.
Well, Francois Germain, it appears that certain states in Europe use this definition of words as a way not to deal with the issue. We have heard the example there of the British Prime Minister. Is this a sign of division among Europeans, or is it something a little bit more sinister in a way, that it is seeking ways to not attempt to deal with the problem? Your view?
I think very much that at the moment there is a huge discrepancy between the way migration are perceived in the public debates and the actual realities of this migration. And in that regard, the language you use, the vocabulary that we use matters a lot. If I take only one example, when we speak of illegal migrants, for example, we instill the idea that these people are somewhat criminals, which of course they are not. And I think that the language we use is really shaping the public perception of the situation. And it seems to me that the public debate is hitting new lows every day. And I want to take this opportunity to really commend your network for thinking carefully about the words that you are using when describing the situation. And at the moment, I think there is a huge responsibility of not only the media, but also of some political leaders in the way they portray this migration with inflammatory comments, which I think are leading us in the situation that we see now. And this is clearly at the expense of the migrants and of the refugees.
Well, Gary van Gulik, in this ongoing discussion in the public debate, it also tends to disappear the fact that we are talking about individual human beings who have gone through great suffering in their countries of origin and are continuing that suffering on their desperate journeys across continents by using a different language, by saying economic migrants, by saying work seekers. One tends to undercut the very humanity of those attempting to find safety, does it not?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And this is something that hits us very often when we do, the interviews, the documenting of the situation of these people trying to reach Europe. It's incredibly important that we all remember who we're talking about. And sometimes these people are dehumanized in the media by politicians and by others. I mean, the individual stories, I remember talking to a woman from Somalia, for example, who brought her little girl over on a boat from Libya. I mean, it's people like that. It's the person you showed the picture of, the Syrian dad who tries to bring his kids to safety. Now, these are the people who are entitled internationally to protection, but we also have a moral imperative to talk about them as human beings, to discuss this in the sense that how can we bring them protection, how can we get them to safety, rather than only talking about this in the horrible way that, for example, David Cameron did, which is as a swarm of people or as a problem, a crisis, how are people coming in, etc. that's the key shift that needs to happen, away from focusing on border controls only, more towards how can we manage this group of people, how can we make sure that those people who need the help, the protection that they're entitled to, how can we get it to them, and how can we do it in a way that prevents the immeasurable suffering that we're seeing now all along the borders of Europe.
Well, Adrian Iberia, it does appear to be as well a denial of history. Decades ago, the world watched while groups of people, hundreds of thousands who became to be known as the boat people, were fleeing conflict. The world generally came together in a remarkable way and assured the safe passage of these hundreds of thousands of people. A very different scenario from what we are looking at today, where nation states appear to be finding reasons not to help rather than reasons to help. Your view?
Well, I think there's a lot of truth in that. I think it's very clear, particularly in the context of Syria's proximity to the European Union, that what we have here is a straightforward refugee crisis. We have, in the European Union, each member state has ratified the Refugee Convention, and each member state is subject to applying the European Convention on Human Rights as a matter of generality. And it seems that the response to this crisis has been to impose controls and border controls and immigration controls on people who are quite plainly refugees. And the obligation on EU member states is to interpret their international obligations and apply them in good faith, and that's not being done. What you see here, where people are trying to cross into the European Union and cross the European Union in an irregular fashion, is actually a product of the fact of two tools which European Union states use to exclude them. The first is visa controls. You can't get a visa to come into the EU on humanitarian grounds. And the second is carrier's liability, where airlines and shipping companies are fined for carrying people without the correct immigration documents. That creates the context in which people who are obviously fleeing persecution from countries like Syria are forced into the methods of transport and the routes of transport, which we see so vividly illustrated on the television. And in the absence of any adequate resettlement program and care for these people as they leave their own countries and their neighbouring countries in order to promote resettlement, then people are forced into irregular forms of migration in order to seek asylum in European Union states.
Well, Francois Germain, we've heard what the problems are, we've heard what is not being done. What needs to change? What can be done to improve the lot of these hundreds of thousands of people?
I think first and foremost, Europe needs to realize that it is its own crisis and that it is its lack of common asylum policy and migration policy that is actually creating these tragedies at sea. So I think that the first step would be really to reestablish legal ways of entry into the European Union for those who need protection and asylum. These people shouldn't come by sea, they should come by plane. It is extremely important also because there is an imbalance between the number of asylum applications that different countries receive, and clearly Greece or Italy are overwhelmed at the moment. It is important that we harmonize the criteria for granting asylum in the EU, and that somehow that we centralize these applications at the European level so that we finally have a common European asylum policy. At the moment, we have a patchwork of 28 different asylum policies with different criteria, different conditions. This is one of the reasons why we have this crisis right now, and really states and governments need to abandon their incendiary discourses like we've heard from the UK Prime Minister or from the Slovakian Prime Minister as well, to really step up to their responsibilities and finally realize that this is a European issue to be addressed.
Well, Gori van Gulik, a short while ago you used the word moral responsibility. Yet many would argue there's a complete abrogation of moral responsibility from many European nations. The statistics are quite staggering. Turkey has taken in 1.8 million people. Lebanon has taken in 1 million refugees. 1 in every 4 person in Lebanon is a refugee. Even Iraq, which has its own problems, is hosting some 200,000 refugees. Let's take a look at the figures in Europe. 340,000 people crossed European borders this year. That's a large number, but that is less than half of 1% of the total European population of 740 million people. Europe is not getting overwhelmed with refugees. It is pretending that it is it not?
I couldn't agree more. I mean, globally, we know now that there's more than 19 million refugees. So million refugees, that's incredible. The numbers are staggering. And this idea that all of those people are going to come to Europe and this fear that is created is absolutely false. We're having fights in Europe between countries over thousands, tens of thousands, but we're nowhere near the numbers that some of the other countries that you mentioned have taken in. So we need to see two forms of solidarity here, two forms of solutions. Number one is more numbers. Whether it's popular politically or not, we're going to have more safe and legal routes into Europe for those who need protection. So we need to see that international solidarity. Europe needs to take on a larger share of its responsibility and of the the global refugee crisis. The second form is internal solidarity. We have to see more support for the member states who are on the borders. An urgent humanitarian crisis is developing in Greece. That needs to be solved also through aid from other countries in Europe. And we need to redevelop, as was mentioned before, the European asylum system. The setup is so dysfunctional right now. All of these crises, including Calais, what we're seeing in Hungary, in Greece, are all the result of an overall failing, dysfunctional European system on how we look at refugees and asylum seekers.
Adrian Berry, in terms of looking at refugees and asylum seekers, surely a crucial point too is that mindset in terms of looking at people who want to move. The general opinion appears to be in many European countries they are a threat. However, great nations have been built on migration in the past, have been built on refugees coming. Surely the mindset should be that there is a benefit to allowing people in rather than trying to keep them out.
Well, it's certainly true that migration, just as settled lives are simply a factor in ordinary human societies and in human behaviour. Countries such as my own in the United Kingdom have benefited enormously from migration generally, particularly in the southeast of England, and London is obviously a highly cosmopolitan city. But the issue for refugees is this is about protection in the first instance as well. And yes, of course, they have a lot to contribute, but even if they didn't, they would still be deserving of dignity and respect, and a humanitarian response would still be required. Europe has in many ways a demographic crisis. It requires working age populations, but those are all arguments about whether it ought to have a sensible migration policy. I think in the current context there's a more pressing requirement, which is that we are receiving people who are fleeing persecution, who are refugees in any event, and that they are coming, and the question is how you organise that, and safe routes for assisting refugees from places like Syria, from places like Eritrea, will prevent some of the distressing scenes we see in the Mediterranean, into Italy and into the Aegean, and onto Kos, where people are travelling in very insecure rafts, placing their lives in jeopardy in order to enter the European Union. We have an obligation in the first instance to provide safe routes for people fleeing persecution, and also to recognise that we may well be hosting those people for some considerable time, and that they may well integrate ultimately into our societies. The numbers are relatively modest in the grand scale of things in terms of the European Union's population, but also the question isn't so much whether it should be permitted, but given that it is happening, how do we respond in a way that is compliant with our humanitarian concerns and general common humanity, as well as with our international obligations?
Francois Germain, very, very quickly, where we are going towards is that ultimately this is a human rights issue that needs to be addressed. It is not one of logistics. It is one about the rights of individual human people. Your view?
Yeah, absolutely. I very much agree that this is a human rights situation, and that it really calls into question the human right to mobility. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights says clearly that everyone has the right to leave his or her country. And I think that what we see at the moment is a blatant violation of the human rights of these people, and this is really that Europe should really be ashamed of. Europe seems to be so keen on the protection of human rights worldwide, and it is not able to actually enforce these human rights on its own soil, and in this matter, in its territorial waters. I think that this is really the shame of Europe and a failure of the European project and European ideal.
Well, on that particular note, my thanks to our guests, Gary van Gulik, Francois Germain, and Adrian Berry. And thank you for watching. If you have any comments about today's show, You can get in touch by going to our programme page at aljazeera.com or post your comments on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story or tweet us at AJ Inside Story. From me, Mike Hanna, and the whole team, goodbye for now.